Welcome back to the Deep Dive, everybody. Today we're diving into a pretty heavy but super important topic, and I'm so glad to have you here with us.
Yeah, this one is really close to home for a lot of people, I think.
Oh, for sure. It's trauma stewardship. And to guide us, we're turning to the book Trauma Stewardship, an everyday guide to caring for self while caring for others by Laura van Dernoot Lipsky. Actually, it's by Laura van Dernoot Lipsky with Connie Burke.
That's right. And this book, it's not just some theoretical framework. It comes from Lipsky's own deep well of experience in all sorts of roles in the helping professions. It's really resonated with people across a whole spectrum of fields, and you can see that in the
I
endorsements.
was going to say the endorsements are kind of a who's who of people who just get it.
Yeah.
You've got John Flicker, who's the president of the National Audubon Society.
Right, and then there's Dr. Michael Tuggai from Swedish.
And these are just two examples. I mean, the book has been recognized by people like Elizabeth Latimer in public defense, Gretchen Test at the Annie E. Casey Foundation, so child welfare, and so many others, especially in the healing professions. These are people who are really on the front lines, seeing and experiencing the heavy stuff firsthand.
Absolutely. And they recognize the need for what Lipsky calls trauma stewardship. It's such a powerful term, right? It's essentially about responsibly managing something that's been entrusted to our care. And while we often think of stewardship in relation to the environment, Lipsky takes that concept and expands it to include, the very real hardship and pain and trauma that we as humans, but also all living beings and even the planet as a whole, are facing.
Right. It's a very holistic approach to caring without being overwhelmed by the weight of it all. And what's really interesting is that Lipsky kind of illustrates this idea with her own personal story, this moment of, I guess you could call it an awakening.
A cliff of awakening, she calls it.
Yeah, exactly. And it takes place in the Caribbean, of
Yeah.
all places. She's surrounded by this stunning beauty, this idyllic scene, and yet her immediate thoughts jump to potential suicides and the logistics of managing a trauma response in that environment.
Yeah, I remember reading that and just, it kind of stops you in your tracks, right? It's like this really stark example of how being constantly exposed to suffering, even indirectly, can really, I don't know, reshape the way you see the world.
Absolutely.
Mm.
And it makes me wonder, have you ever had a moment like that where you suddenly realized that the work you do, or even just, being exposed to the news and everything happening in the world, was affecting you on a much deeper level than you initially thought?
Oh, 100%. I think that's a pretty universal experience for anyone who's paying attention these days.
I agree. And I think that's really what this deep dive is all about. It's about unpacking that experience, really understanding how we absorb the impact of the world's difficulties.
Yeah.
And then, figuring out what we can do about it,
Yeah.
exploring those paths toward renewal and a sustainable sense of equilibrium.
Right. Like, how do we keep caring without being crushed by it all?
Exactly.
Hmm.
So where should we begin? I mean, how does this even happen? This process of absorbing the trauma of others?
Well, Lipsky talks about it as almost a process of osmosis. Like, it's not this sudden one-time event, but more of a gradual absorption. It kind of seeps in.
Right. So it's this idea that being repeatedly exposed to the trauma of others, whether through your job or other means, can lead to this slow, almost imperceptible accumulation of that emotional weight and can kind of shift your worldview without you even realizing it.
Yeah, and she really pushes back against the idea that we always have to be tough and that self-care is somehow weak or self-indulgent.
Oh, I hear that all the time. Suck it up, buttercup.
Right. But Lipsky argues that ignoring the effects of this kind of trauma exposure, it's not a sign of strength. It actually allows those effects to dig in even deeper. It lets them take root.
It's like allowing a small kite to become infected, right?
Exactly. And so recognizing that and choosing a different path, that's essential for our well-being, both personally and professionally.
And what's really important to remember is that this isn't limited to those in the traditional helping professions.
Absolutely.
Anyone who witnesses hardship on a regular basis, even indirectly, can be affected by this.
Yeah, even just being plugged into the 24-hour news cycle can be a form of trauma exposure.
Oh, absolutely. And I think what's so reassuring about Lipsky's framework is that our responses to this kind of exposure, they're not random. They're not unique to us. They're patterns.
Right.
And lots of people will see themselves in the feelings and behavior she describes. It's not just you.
And what's valuable is that the book goes beyond just identifying those patterns. It offers practical tools and real guidance for navigating those responses in a healthier way. So it's not just doom and gloom. It's like, okay, here's what's happening and here's what you can do about it.
I like that. It's empowering. So let's talk about the role of, our workplaces and even society as a whole in all of this, because it's not solely about individual resilience, right?
Right. Lipsky emphasizes how organizational cultures and societal norms, they really impact how we experience and cope with trauma exposure. Like if those responses are ignored or dismissed, it can create this really unhealthy environment. Workplaces that are defensive, exclusionary, even hopeless.
It's the overall vibe of a place, right? And it's less about the inherent difficulty of the work itself and more about whether the organization supports the well-being of its people.
Absolutely. And she gives these great examples of environments that did foster well-being, like the early days of the People of Color Against AIDS Network in Seattle. And they were doing incredibly difficult and emotionally heavy work, but there was also this strong sense of community and shared purpose, like they had each other's
So
backs.
it's like even in the midst of all that, you can create a positive microculture.
Exactly.
That's so important. Lipsky also talks about systematic oppression in this context. What does she mean by that?
So she's talking about how misunderstanding, alienation, and those Ustam binaries, they contribute to this sense of oppression. And what's key is that this can make the impact of trauma exposure even worse because you feel so isolated. Like if people outside your work don't understand what you're dealing with, it adds another layer of
That
difficulty.
makes it even harder to reach out for support.
Exactly.
So it's important to really think about the atmosphere of your own workplace. Is it designed to support well-being? Or is it inadvertently making things harder?
That's a great question for everyone to consider.
I agree. Okay, so let's dig into some of the specific ways that trauma exposure can show up in our lives. Because I think a lot of people might be experiencing these things and not even realizing it's connected to their work or, their exposure to trauma.
Right. And Lipsky outlines 16 warning signs. We probably won't have time to go through all of them today, but let's touch on a few key ones.
Okay, sounds good.
So one of the big ones is this feeling of helplessness and hopelessness. And it's
Yep.
not just about feeling sad, it's that erosion of agency, like that belief that your efforts don't really matter.
Oh, I know that feeling. And the book shares this really poignant example of a frog scientist who's witnessing amphibian extinction. And he's just heartbroken. It's that feeling of like watching something you care about deeply just disappear. And you feel powerless to stop it.
It's that feeling of like, what's the point?
Exactly. And I think a lot of people, especially those drawn to like social justice work or environmental activism, can really relate to that. Like, have you ever felt that sense of overwhelming doom or futility in the face of the challenges you're facing?
Oh, yeah, for sure. It can be so easy to get bogged down in that.
Absolutely. Another warning sign Lipsky talks about is this sense of inadequacy, like that feeling of never being enough, never doing enough. And it often stems from this clash between our personal beliefs about ourselves and our professional beliefs about what we should be doing.
Yeah, it's like this double whammy. You feel like you're failing on both a personal and a professional level.
And she points out that societal messages, or sometimes the lack of messages about sustainability and the long-term impact of our efforts, can really feed into this. Like if you don't see evidence that things are getting better, it can feel like you're just throwing yourself into a bottomless pit.
I think a lot of us struggle with that, especially in work that feels really urgent.
Definitely. And then there's hypervigilance, which is something I think a lot of people might relate to, especially in today's world. It's that state of constant alertness, like you're always scanning for potential threats.
Always on edge.
Yeah, exactly. And while it might be helpful in certain situations, Lipsky points out that it can make it really hard to relax and be present in other areas of your life. Like you're always waiting for the other shoe to drop.
I see this a lot with people who are really plugged into social media. Like they're constantly bombarded with negative news, and it becomes really hard to turn off that sense of alarm.
Oh, for sure. Lipsky even mentions the example of the Seattle Jewish Federation hate crime and how events like that can really heighten this sense of needing to be on guard all the time. And technology can really exacerbate that.
Oh, totally. It's like we're tethered to this constant stream of information and potential threats.
Another warning sign that I thought was really interesting is diminished creativity.
Yeah, how so?
Well, Lipsky explains that exposure to trauma can make you crave structure and predictability. Like you're trying to manage the chaos inside by controlling the outside.
Right, so you stick to what's familiar, what feels safe.
Exactly. But the problem is that can stifle innovation. You stop taking risks, you stop trying new things, and that can lead to stagnation, both personally and professionally.
Yeah, I could see that. It's like that saying, you can't discover new oceans unless you have the courage to lose sight of the shore.
I love that.
Yeah.
And Lipsky also talks about this tendency to take sides, which I think can be a real trap in emotionally charged environments.
What do you mean by that?
It's like you feel this urge to see everything in black and white, to find the good guys and the bad guys. And it can make you really rigid and judgmental.
So you lose that nuance, that ability to see the gray areas.
Exactly. And it can create a lot of conflict and tension, both at work and in your personal relationships.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like that emotional intensity kind of spills over into everything.
Right. And then there's minimizing, which is something I know I've been guilty of.
Hmm.
It's when you downplay the struggles of others, maybe your partner or your kids.
Because in comparison to what you're dealing with, their problems seem small.
Exactly. And Lipsky talks about how this can be a way of disconnecting and not fully engaging with the people around you.
And it can be really invalidating to the other person, even if you don't mean it that way.
Yeah, it's like you're saying, your feelings don't matter as much as mine. Guilt is another big one. Like that feeling of responsibility or remorse, even for things you can't control.
It can be so heavy.
And Lipsky explains how guilt can really interfere with your ability to be present and to enjoy the good things in your life. Like she gives examples of people feeling guilty for having a car or being in a loving relationship because others don't have those things.
It's that feeling of how can I be happy when so many people are suffering?
Yeah, exactly. And fear, of course, plays a huge role in all of this.
Fear can be so paralyzing.
Right. Lipsky points out that fear can really stifle our creativity and our ability to think clearly. She even quotes that line from Dune, fear is the mind killer.
That's so good.
And then there's anger, which can be a really tricky one because it can be present even when we're not consciously aware of it.
And it can leak out in our interactions with others, even when we don't mean to.
Lipsky shares this anecdote about Air Force personnel being asked to explore their anger with their loved ones. And it turns out that often the people closest to us are more aware of our anger than we are.
It's like they can see it bubbling under the surface, even when we're trying to keep it contained.
Right. And then there's addiction and compulsive behaviors, which are ways that people try to numb themselves from the pain they're carrying.
And those behaviors can work for a while, but eventually they stop being effective.
And then you're left with the original pain and the consequences of the addiction.
Right. It's a vicious cycle.
Okay. And another one that might seem a little counterintuitive is grandiosity, like an inflated sense of self-importance related to your work.
Yeah. How does that fit into all of this?
Well, Lipsky talks about how it can lead to this reliance on others' suffering to feel a sense of purpose. Like you need people to be in need so that you can feel needed.
That's kind of a twisted way of looking at it, but I can see how it could happen.
Yeah, and it can be really insidious because it's often disguised as altruism.
So it's not always easy to recognize in ourselves.
Exactly. Another warning sign is the inability to listen or deliberate avoidance.
Like when you just shut down and tune out.
Exactly. The book gives this image of a nurse's voicemail box that's completely full because she's just too overwhelmed to listen to any more messages.
That's such a vivid image.
Right. And Lipsky shares a personal story about her partner actually dissociating while she was telling him about a traumatic experience. And it really illustrates how overwhelming emotions can lead us to just shut down completely.
Dissociation is another warning sign, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's basically that sense of being disconnected from your own internal experience. It's like a way of protecting yourself from feeling too much.
It's a coping mechanism.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then there's this sense of persecution, which Lipsky clarifies doesn't necessarily mean that there's an actual person or entity persecuting you. It's more about that feeling of being wronged, that the world is against you.
So it's more of an internal state than an external reality.
Right. And then there's loss of perspective, which is when you lose sight of the bigger picture. Like all you can see is the immediate pain and suffering that you're dealing with.
That can make it really hard to find hope or to see any possibility for change.
Exactly. And finally, and this might seem obvious, but fatigue.
Being tired all the time.
Yeah. Lipsky points out that trauma exposure is exhausting in and of itself. And then you combine that with things like helplessness and hypervigilance, and it's no wonder people are feeling burnt out.
Right. It's like a recipe for exhaustion.
And she also mentions this often overlooked factor, which is the feeling that you have no choice but to do this work. Like it's your duty, your calling.
And that sense of obligation can really add to the burden.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've talked about some of the ways trauma exposure can manifest in our lives, but now let's switch gears and talk about the paths toward trauma stewardship.
Yeah, like what can we actually do to protect ourselves and build resilience?
Exactly. And Lipsky outlines 5 key directions, and the first one is creating space for inquiry. It's in the north if you're visualizing it like a compass.
Okay, I'm visualizing.
And the idea here is that we need to regularly ask ourselves why we're doing the work we're doing. Like, what are our underlying motivations?
So it's not just about blindly doing the work, it's about understanding what's driving us.
Exactly. And Lipsky shares the story about the Northwest Immigrant Rights Project, NRRP. And they were so overwhelmed with cases that they were all burning out.
That sounds familiar.
Right. And they eventually decided to limit the number of cases they were taking on. And it was a really difficult decision because, they wanted to help everyone. But they realized that in order to be effective in the long run, they needed to set boundaries.
So prioritizing sustainability over immediate gratification.
Exactly. And they actually found that once they set those boundaries, they felt a huge sense of relief.
So it's actually beneficial for everyone involved.
Yeah. Lipsky also talks about this idea of trauma mastery in this context.
What does that mean?
It's like sometimes we're subconsciously drawn to our work as a way of trying to control or heal from our own past trauma.
Oh, interesting. So, for example, someone who experienced a lot of neglect as a child might be drawn to a helping profession where they're constantly nurturing others.
Exactly. And it's not always a bad thing, but it's important to be aware of those underlying motivations.
So that we can make sure we're operating from a place of genuine care and not just reacting to our own wounds.
Exactly. The second direction is choosing our focus, and that's in the East.
Okay, so north is inquiry, east is focus. Got it.
And this is all about the power of conscious attention. It's not about positive thinking or ignoring the negative, but it's about recognizing that we have a choice in where we direct our attention.
So even in the midst of really challenging situations, we have some agency.
Lipsky uses this great metaphor of surfing. Like you're learning to ride the waves,
Yeah.
even when they're unpredictable. And you can't control the waves, but you can control how you respond to them.
I like that. It's about finding your balance.
Exactly. And she introduces this practice of resourcing, which is basically actively remembering moments, people, places that bring you joy and peace.
So like creating a mental library of positive experiences that you can tap into when you need to regulate your nervous system.
Exactly. She also talks about Helen Howell's story, who realized that she was living in this constant state of intensity and needed to find a more balanced approach.
That's something a lot of us can relate to.
Oh, yeah. And this direction also encourages us to develop a plan B for our lives and careers. It's not about giving up on your dreams, but it's about having alternative visions in mind, just in case.
So that you don't feel like you're trapped.
Exactly. The third direction is building compassion and community, and that's in the South.
Okay, building community. I feel like this is something we've talked about a lot on the show.
Oh, yeah, it's so crucial. And Lipsky emphasizes the importance of creating that supportive microculture around us, whether it's with our colleagues, our family, our friends, like people who get it and who have our backs.
She mentions Peter Senja's concept of conscious oversight from the Quakers, where everyone takes responsibility for looking out for each other. I like that idea.
Me too. It's not just about one person being the designated caregiver. It's about everyone looking out for each other.
And she also gives the example of the family hug rule, like just a simple practice of physical touch to show support.
I love that.
It's so simple, but it can be so powerful.
Totally. And this direction also highlights the importance of bringing together trauma survivors and service providers, like creating spaces where they can share their experiences and learn from each other.
Because they both have so much wisdom to offer.
Exactly. And Lipsky reminds us that compassion isn't just a reaction to suffering. It can be a proactive choice, like a way of being in the world that can actually decrease suffering.
I love that framing. It's so empowering.
Okay, fourth direction is finding balance, and that's in the West.
Finding balance. That sounds lovely.
Right. And this is about engaging with life outside of work, like actually taking time for yourself and the things that bring you joy.
Easier said than done, right?
Oh, for sure. But Lipsky shares this anecdote about a domestic violence advocate who, as a form of self-care, would take these mindful 5-minute lunch breaks. Like she would just step away from everything and focus on her breath. And that was enough to help her reset.
It's the small moments that can make a big difference.
Totally. And Lipsky also encourages us to, negotiate work schedules that are sustainable and to surround ourselves with colleagues who also prioritize balance.
Because it's so much easier to take care of yourself when you're surrounded by people who are doing the same.
Absolutely. She also talks about this idea of moving internal energy.
What does that mean?
It's basically learning from animals about how they release the physiological responses to threat. Because, when we experience trauma, our bodies go into fight or flight mode.
Right, that adrenaline rush.
Exactly. And if we don't release that energy, it can get trapped in our bodies and contribute to the effects of trauma.
So moving our bodies can help us process those emotions and release that tension.
Exactly. Lipsky also highlights the power of humor.
Humor.
Yeah, and she tells this amazing story about Heather Anderson, who used humor to avert a car accident. And she also talks about her experience using humor in a grief support group. And it's a reminder that laughter can be so healing, even in the midst of really difficult times.
We tend to forget that. We take things so seriously.
Totally. Okay, and the fifth and final direction is a daily practice of centering myself. And that's in the center of our compass.
So it's like the foundation of everything else.
Exactly. And this is all about cultivating presence and awareness in our daily lives. Lipsky talks about this concept of zero tasking.
Zero tasking.
It's the opposite of multitasking. It's the practice of just being without the pressure to be doing something productive.
Just allowing yourself to be present in the moment.
Exactly. She also talks about attuning to our felt sense, which is that subtle internal awareness of how we're feeling in our bodies and minds.
Like really paying attention to those internal cues.
Right. And she references Dr. Ludong's teachings about finding a balance between our external focus and our internal awareness, like not getting so caught up in the world outside that we lose touch with ourselves.
That's so important.
And this direction really highlights the value of stillness, like incorporating practices like mindful breathing and meditation into our daily lives.
She shares Cherry Maple's story, who went from a career in law enforcement to mindfulness training.
Wow, what a shift.
Yeah, and her story really illustrates how much we need these practices, especially in high-stress professions.
Lipsky also talks about the mindfulness bell as a way to gently bring us back to the present moment throughout the day.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that. It's like a little reminder to pause and take a breath.
Exactly. And then she mentions Harry Spence's suggestion about setting intentions at the beginning of the day and letting go of what no longer serves us at the end of the day.
It's like creating a container for your day.
I love that. So as we come to the end of this deep dive, I think the core message of trauma stewardship is really clear. It's about cultivating a deep and ongoing awareness so that we can effectively care for ourselves while continuing to care for others and the world around us.
It's not an either or proposition. It's about finding that balance.
Exactly. And Lipsky reminds us that this is a process. It takes time, it takes practice, and most importantly, it takes self-compassion.
So as we wrap up, I want to leave you with this question. What is one small, concrete step you can take today to create a little more space for inquiry in your life? Maybe it's setting aside 5 minutes for mindful breathing, or maybe it's having a conversation with a friend about how you're feeling. Whatever it is, know that it's not selfish to prioritize your own well-being. It's actually essential for doing this work in a way that's sustainable and effective.
I think that's a perfect note to end on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We encourage you to check out Trauma Stewardship by Laura van Dernoot Lipsky, and to continue exploring this topic in your own lives.
Thanks for having me.
Well, of course. It was great having you here.